Imagine serving a ruler so young, his voice still unbroken, yet his commands could end the lives of men who had fought in 100 battles. Imagine a boy who smiles at suffering the way other children smile at toys. In Rome, the year is 220 AD, and tonight you will hear a truth they have buried for centuries. If you value forbidden history, subscribe now, like this video and share it, because once you know what I'm about to tell you, you will never unsee it. You are a Praetorian Guard, hardened by war, loyal to emperors who rose and fell like the sun. But nothing, not blades, not blood, not the groans of dying men, prepared you for serving Elagabalus, a 14-year-old boy who wore the purple not as a burden, but as a playground. That night, the great bronze doors groaned open. He emerged draped in silks worth more than a legion's annual pay. His face painted in pigments stolen from the east, neck hung with strange symbols, half Roman, half something older, darker. But it wasn't the clothes that froze your blood. It was his eyes, the cold, perfect cruelty of a child who has never been told no. Behind him, slaves carried blood-stained robes and shattered jewelry, the remains of guests who had entered his chambers alive and left as whispers. The marble floors were still wet. The silence that followed the screaming was worse than the screaming itself. What you didn't yet know was that this boy's 4-year reign would contain more systemic cruelty, more inventive humiliation, more destruction of human dignity, than emperors who ruled for decades. And as you watched him smile, that small, satisfied smile, you understood something ancient and terrifying. When innocence and absolute power merge, the result is not purity, but a predator born in silk. They called him Varius Avitus Bassianus. But names are masks. History would remember him by another, Elagabalus, the boy priest of a foreign sun god. Born in 204 AD in the desert lands of Syria, he carried in his veins a sickness bred in imperial bloodlines, the kind that festers over generations, hidden behind marble walls and golden crowns. His mother, Julia Soaemias, was the architect of this nightmare. Beautiful, cunning, utterly without conscience, she knew exactly what her son was, and what he could become. Syria itself was already a place Romans whispered about. Temples where sacred prostitution was celebrated as divine ritual, altars where blood flowed in sacrifice, ceremonies where the boundary between worship and degradation vanished. In that environment, young Elagabalus learned a dangerous lesson. In the eyes of his god, pleasure was holy, pain was sacred, and human beings were simply offerings. From his earliest years, no one denied him. Servants smoothed over tantrums. Tutors praised his cruelty as natural leadership. Family members encouraged his beauty and wit, seeing in them tools for manipulation. By the age of 10, tears got him anything he desired. By 12, he found violence far more efficient. And by 14, when Rome's throne fell vacant, he had mastered the art of using living human beings as props in his own entertainment. His rise was no accident. It was engineered through lies, bribery, and blood. When Emperor Caracalla was assassinated in 217 AD, the empire fell into the hands of a deeply unpopular man named Macrinus. Julia saw her chance. She spread the lie that her son was Caracalla's illegitimate heir, a claim easily disproven, but soldiers wanted higher pay, not truth. Gold from temple treasuries bought the loyalty of commanders. And here is the chilling part. Julia knew her son's taste for humiliation, his casual appetite for cruelty. She saw them not as weaknesses, but as weapons. She promised her allies wealth, power, and freedom from Roman law, while quietly imagining the spectacle her boy would bring to the throne. When Macrinus was overthrown at the Battle of Antioch in 218 AD, his severed head was delivered to the boy emperor. Witnesses described Elagabalus smiling, not with triumph but like a child handed a new toy. His first act as emperor? Publicly displaying the heads of his enemies around the temple. His second? Inventing games where prisoners competed for freedom, games that would soon descend into rituals of humiliation so elaborate, Rome had no words for them. At first, the game seemed almost merciful. Captured officers were forced to run races around the temple complex carrying heavy stones. The winners walked away with gold and freedom. The losers faced a quick death. Rome had seen worse, or so they thought. But Elagabalus was watching, and as he watched, something in his gaze shifted. He wasn't entertained by the competition. He was entertained by the struggle, the stumbling, the desperation, the moment a man's spirit cracked. And so he began to improve the rules. Mud was mixed with animal waste and poured along the track. Prisoners had to crawl through it on bleeding knees. Then came physical punishments for losers. Not simple beatings but degradations that stripped them of dignity as much as life. The Syrian priests smiled at these innovations, calling them ritual purification, too blind, or too corrupted, to admit what was really happening. Those who resisted the games disappeared quietly. Not executed publicly, no spectacle, no warning. Just gone. Rome would learn that silence was more frightening than blood. The journey from Syria to Rome became a moving carnival of depravity. Elagabalus traveled in an ornate litter carried by slaves chosen for beauty, not strength, a living trophy case of faces and bodies that pleased him. In every city, governors brought tributes, not gold, not weapons, but their most beautiful young citizens, boys and girls barely into adolescence, handed over like offerings to a god. These gifts were never voluntary. They were taken from homes, torn from families, told they would serve the emperor in divine service. What that meant, they would discover too late. At night, the imperial tent became a palace of many chambers. Some rooms held altars for Syrian rituals. Others were bedrooms where the boy emperor indulged himself with his newest acquisitions. The most disturbing rooms were the so-called schools, where Elagabalus gave personal lessons to his captives, explaining their duties in excruciating detail. This was not education. It was indoctrination into degradation. Those who resisted did not scream. They vanished. The guards learned never to ask about empty beds. And still Rome waited, unaware that the horrors on the road were only the warm-up act. The real performance would begin in the palace. The Palatine Palace had stood for centuries, echoing with the footsteps of Augustus, Trajan, and Marcus Aurelius. It was built for governance, for the business of empire. But within months of Elagabalus's arrival, it no longer felt Roman at all. His first command was not about law, armies, or the Senate. It was about space. Rooms once reserved for councils of state were demolished, replaced with towering altars carved in the style of his Syrian god. Columns dripped with gold leaf. Walls were painted not with noble victories or gods in glory, but with scenes so explicit, seasoned craftsmen worked behind locked doors to avoid public scandal. Every piece of furniture had a purpose. Some for kneeling, some for binding, some for acts no Roman historian dared to describe in ink. These were not props for private pleasure. They were instruments of ritual, designed for an audience. The staff of the palace was reorganized. No longer were slaves assigned to simple duties like cooking or cleaning. They were divided into categories: the beautiful to be paraded in ceremonies, the discreet to maintain and prepare specialized equipment, and the silent whose only task was to erase evidence after events no outsider could ever be allowed to witness. And people began to vanish. Not in the loud way of political purges, no trials, no public executions, but in the quiet way that leaves no trace. A servant would be seen one day, gone the next, their quarters reassigned as if they had never existed. Elagabalus was not content to keep his rituals hidden. He began folding them into official state functions. Ambassadors expecting to negotiate trade found themselves guests in ceremonies where they could not look away. Senators summoned to discuss law were instead forced to take part in religious acts that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. These were not fits of youthful madness. They were planned, precise, and deliberate. The boy emperor was breaking his subjects in ways bloodshed alone never could. Each ritual was a test, to see how far dignity could be stripped away before submission became permanent. Those who yielded completely were rewarded. Those who hesitated were erased. In this palace, survival was no longer about loyalty to Rome. It was about surrendering your soul to its emperor. Rome's noble families had survived tyrants before. Caligula, Nero, Domitian. All had tried to humiliate the Senate, strip away its power, and bend its members to their will. The patricians thought they knew the game: flatter the emperor in public, whisper dissent in private, and wait for time or fate to remove him. But Elagabalus was not playing the old game. He was inventing a new one. He began inviting, or rather summoning, the daughters and sons of Rome's most ancient houses to the palace. These were not formal receptions. Parents were excluded. The invitations were not written in ink, but carried by imperial guards who made it clear refusal was not an option. The young nobles were not treated as political guests. They were assessed, like livestock at a market. Beauty, health, obedience, these became their currency. A flawless face or a perfect body could mean rapid ascent in the emperor's inner circle. Any hint of defiance could mean disappearance. Elagabalus understood something most emperors did not. Destroy a man's bloodline and you destroy him far more effectively than with a sword. The old families began to break from the inside. Fathers who once stood tall in the Senate now whispered among themselves, debating how much of their own blood they could sacrifice to preserve the rest. Soon, the palace became a spider's web of noble sons and daughters, each one caught in silken threads of fear, favor, and shame. Some were paraded in public festivals dressed in foreign silks, performing dances from distant provinces, a spectacle meant not for entertainment, but for humiliation. Others vanished into the palace's private wings, and were never seen again, their names stricken from family records. But the most disturbing fate was reserved for those the emperor liked best. They were not destroyed quickly. They were kept close, reshaped, re-educated, remade into servants of his will. What began as captivity became dependence. These former heirs to ancient Roman legacies became tools to control their own parents, reporting every whisper of dissent back to the boy emperor. By the end of his first year in Rome, Elagabalus had done what even the most ruthless rulers before him had failed to achieve. The nobility still existed, but their pride was gone. Their children were no longer heirs, they were hostages dressed in silk. The private wing of the Palatine Palace was unlike anything in Rome. No guards stood at its doors, at least none in uniform. Instead, silent figures in loose black garments moved without sound, their faces covered, their eyes never meeting those of the passers-by. The entrance was a threshold in more ways than one. Beyond it, the architecture itself changed. Roman marble gave way to Syrian stonework, walls etched with symbols that no scholar dared translate. The air was thick with burning incense, sweet at first, then cloying, almost suffocating. Those brought here were led through narrow corridors lit only by oil lamps. The light was low but not so dim that it concealed the murals. Every wall depicted scenes of gods and mortals intertwined in acts so elaborate they looked like performances, yet there was a violence beneath them. Ropes, chains, mouths open in silent screams. At the center of the wing was a vast chamber, the Hall of Petals. The floor was covered in layers of rose petals, so deep a person's feet would disappear into them. The fragrance was overwhelming, but it was not meant to be pleasant. Beneath the petals, sharp fragments of glass and bone had been scattered, hidden from view. Anyone barefoot, and here everyone would feel the sting eventually. Elagabalus would enter in robes that shimmered like oil on water, surrounded by attendants carrying golden bowls of wine and honey. He never addressed his guests directly at first. Instead, he would walk among them, touching a shoulder here, lifting a chin there, as if appraising works of art. The rituals that followed blurred the line between religious rite and performance of power. Those who resisted were not punished openly. Instead, they were subjected to slow humiliations, made to stand for hours under a constant drizzle of scented water, or to recite foreign prayers they could not understand until their voices broke. Some began to obey simply to end the ordeal. Others, broken by exhaustion and fear, went further, participating willingly in acts they would have spat upon weeks before. The line between captive and devotee vanished. And all the while, scribes in the shadows took notes. Not of the ceremonies themselves, but of every reaction, every hesitation, every sign of eagerness. This was not chaos. It was intelligence gathering, building a map of weaknesses to be exploited later. Here, survival did not depend on strength or cleverness. It depended on surrender. And surrender in the private wing was permanent. For most emperors, the private chamber and the public arena were separate worlds. What happened in the shadows stayed there, veiled behind the dignity of the imperial image. Elagabalus had no such boundaries. By his second year, Rome's people began to notice changes in the festivals and games. What had once been grand parades of generals, senators, and gladiators became strange processions, filled with costumed dancers from the east, exotic animals adorned with jewels, and young nobles dressed in silks that clung to their bodies like second skins. The citizens cheered at first. Rome loved spectacle, and the emperor seemed eager to provide it. But as the months passed, the cheers grew uneasy. The dances became more suggestive, the performances more ritualistic. Chariots carried not warriors, but veiled figures swaying to slow, hypnotic rhythms. The same symbols carved into the private wing's walls began appearing in public decorations, on banners, archways, and even the emperor's own robes. No one knew their meaning, but whispers began. They were not Roman, they were not Latin, and they were not harmless. Elagabalus himself often appeared in these processions, not as a ruler but as a priest, or perhaps something more dangerous. He wore towering headdresses of gold and onyx, his face painted with lines and spirals, his arms bare and covered in oils that caught the sunlight. In one infamous festival, he entered the arena in a golden chariot drawn not by horses, but by naked youths bound together with red silk. This was not entertainment. This was indoctrination. The line between religion, politics, and pleasure blurred until it no longer existed. The emperor's god, the Syrian sun deity Elagabal, was placed above Jupiter in public worship. The Senate protested quietly, but no one dared speak openly. The people themselves were being reshaped, not through laws or armies, but through symbols, songs, and the slow corrosion of the old Roman identity. And always, the faces in the processions were the same ones who had vanished from noble homes. They smiled for the crowd, their eyes glazed, their movements too precise to be spontaneous. To the untrained eye they were performers. To those who knew, they were trophies. By the time the games ended each year, Rome's citizens would leave the arenas changed. Not by bloodshed or war, but by the quiet, creeping sensation that the world they had known was dissolving, replaced by something foreign, seductive, and irreversible. It was the height of summer when Elagabalus announced a divine banquet, to be held in the great amphitheater. Invitations were not extended, they were commanded. Senators, generals, foreign envoys, and the wealthiest families of Rome were told to attend. Even the city's most pious priests were summoned, though they would soon wish they hadn't come. The arena floor had been transformed into something unrecognizable. Instead of sand, it was covered in fragrant herbs and flower petals, their colors vivid under the blazing sun. Towering braziers released clouds of sweet-smelling smoke that hung heavy in the air, making every breath a little slower, a little heavier. In the center stood a massive banquet table shaped like a ring, its surface laden with exotic foods, figs stuffed with gold dust, roasted peacocks with gemstone eyes, fish from distant seas, and wines so strong they could dull the senses in a single cup. Yet it was not the food that captured attention. From hidden gates, dozens of boys and girls emerged, each dressed in translucent silks, their bodies painted with shimmering oils. They moved in unison, not like dancers but like puppets pulled by unseen strings, their eyes vacant yet fixed on the emperor. Elagabalus entered last, wearing a robe so heavy with jewels it required 2 attendants to carry its train. He did not speak at first, simply circling the table, touching the shoulder of one guest, the hair of another. When he finally addressed the crowd, his voice was low, almost hypnotic. "This is not a feast," he said. "It is a sacrifice." What followed blurred the lines between ceremony and madness. The performers began to feed the guests with their own hands, pressing morsels to their lips, pouring wine directly into their mouths. At first it was strange but harmless, until the music changed. Slow rhythms turned to pounding drums, and the feeding became more insistent, more intimate. Some guests resisted, only to be restrained by the silk-clad youths whose strength belied their delicate appearance. Then the flowers above the guests began to fall, not gently but in torrents. Petals rained down so thick they obscured vision, clogged mouths, and smothered breaths. Panic broke out as the blessing became a suffocating trap. Several guests collapsed before the attendants finally pulled the petals away, revealing flushed faces, some gasping, some motionless. Elagabalus watched it all with a faint smile, as if studying the reactions, memorizing every expression of fear, submission, or defiance. The survivors left that day not speaking of the food or the music or the wealth on display. They spoke only of the choking flowers, and of the way the emperor's eyes had seemed to glow in the smoke. The banquet of petals was not an isolated event. It was a trial run. In the months that followed, Elagabalus hosted more of these divine banquets, each more dangerous than the last. On the surface they remained spectacles, opulent displays of wealth and excess meant to dazzle Rome's elite. But beneath the silks and perfumes lay a far more calculated purpose, to measure obedience. The emperor had learned something from that first suffocating feast. Some guests had panicked. Some had fought. But others had smiled through the choking petals, never flinching, never resisting. These were the ones Elagabalus remembered. They had passed his unspoken test. Soon, invitations to these gatherings became marks of both honor and dread. Declining was not an option. Attending meant surrendering oneself to whatever blessing the emperor devised. One banquet featured dishes laced with mind-altering herbs from the east, served only after hours of ritual chanting. Another saw guests seated beneath massive nets filled with rose petals and golden dust, nets that would fall without warning, trapping the diners until they either clawed free or collapsed. And always the emperor watched. His gaze moved from face to face, as though he could see straight into the mind of each guest, weighing their loyalty not by their words but by their willingness to endure humiliation, fear, and the slow erosion of personal dignity. Whispers spread through the Senate. These feasts were not mere games. They were a purge in disguise. Those who displeased the emperor at the table rarely returned home. Some vanished into the labyrinthine corridors of the imperial palace. Others were found days later, their bodies dumped in alleys, their deaths officially attributed to illness, or accident. The public never witnessed these horrors directly, but the effects rippled through the city. Senators became more pliant. Generals more silent. Rome's most powerful men, warriors who had commanded legions, crushed rebellions and negotiated with kings, now sat meekly in the emperor's presence, afraid to touch a goblet or lift a morsel of food without permission. It was no longer a matter of politics. It was psychological warfare, conducted not in the Senate, not on the battlefield but at the dinner table. And the longer it continued, the more it blurred into something else entirely. A ritual of submission, a ceremony where power was measured not in swords or laws, but in how far a man would go to please his master. Yet even for Elagabalus, there was one banquet so infamous, so drenched in blood and terror, that it would mark the beginning of his downfall. It began like all the others, with a summons no one could refuse. The invitation bore the imperial seal, but unlike previous feasts, it contained a single unsettling line beneath the date and location. Tonight, Rome will be reborn. The guests arrived at the palace expecting excess, perhaps another suffocating flood of petals or a meal laced with strange herbs. But the moment they stepped inside, they sensed something different. The corridors were silent. No music. No chatter. Only the muffled sound of dripping water somewhere deep within the walls. The banquet hall itself was shrouded in darkness, save for a circle of blazing torches illuminating a single long table. Upon it lay no food, no wine, only a scattering of black bowls, each covered with a slab of cloth. Elagabalus appeared from the shadows, not in his jewel-encrusted robes, but in a simple white garment streaked with crimson stains. His face was painted in streaks of red and gold, his eyes shining with a manic intensity. Without a word, he walked to the head of the table and pulled away one of the cloths. Gasps echoed through the hall. Inside the bowl was not fruit or bread, but a severed hand, its skin pale and waxy, a gold ring still on its finger. "This," the emperor said softly, "is the hand of a traitor. Tonight we dine on the flesh of treachery." One by one the bowls were uncovered, each containing a different piece of human remains, some identifiable, others unrecognizable. The guests recoiled, some covering their mouths, others staring in frozen horror. Then came the final command, "Eat." At first no one moved. Elagabalus simply stood there, waiting. Then he began to pace, speaking in a voice that was almost tender. "You have feasted on my gold. You have drunk my wine. You have sung my praises. But loyalty," he tapped his chest, "loyalty is proven in sacrifice." Those who refused were seized by attendants and dragged away into the darkness. The ones who obeyed, trembling, retching, forcing down whatever lay in their bowls, were allowed to remain. Elagabalus watched every bite, memorizing each face. By the end of the night, the table was nearly empty. The guests were pale, silent, and broken. And the emperor? He stood among them smiling as if he had just conducted not a meal but a ritual, one that bound every survivor to him in blood and terror. What Elagabalus did not yet realize was that this night, far from securing his reign, had sown the seeds of a conspiracy that would soon close in around him. The survivors left the palace that night like ghosts. They did not speak as they crossed the moonlit streets of Rome. They did not glance at one another. But inside each carried the same poisonous thought: this cannot go on. For weeks afterward, the city seemed quieter, as if holding its breath. The Senate conducted business in a strained, mechanical fashion. Those who had been present at the final banquet avoided gatherings, their eyes darting nervously whenever an imperial messenger appeared. Some drank heavily. Others prayed in secret to gods they had long abandoned. And then the whispers began. They started in the farthest corners of the palace, among slaves, kitchen servants, and guards who had overheard too much. These whispers drifted outward into the barracks, the markets, and finally the homes of Rome's most powerful men. They spoke of an emperor gone mad, a ruler who no longer saw his subjects as human but as tools for his amusement, flesh to be toyed with, broken and discarded. At first, the survivors of the banquet kept silent. Fear still held them in its grip. But fear has a limit. And when word came that Elagabalus was planning another rebirth, one that would involve hundreds, perhaps thousands, something inside them shifted. The first meeting took place in the villa of a respected senator whose own nephew had vanished after the banquet of petals. 5 men sat in a candlelit chamber, each swearing an oath that none had dared to consider before, to end the emperor's reign. But to kill Elagabalus was no simple task. His personal guard was fiercely loyal, or at least bound to him by the same rituals of fear and blood. The conspirators knew they would need help from those who commanded the legions. That meant the Praetorian Guard, Rome's most elite soldiers, the very men sworn to protect the emperor. So they began weaving a web, quiet promises, subtle bribes, and carefully planted stories about how the emperor's madness would doom not just Rome's dignity but its survival. Meanwhile, Elagabalus seemed unaware, or perhaps unconcerned. He spent his days staging elaborate mock battles in the palace gardens, his nights lost in ceremonies drenched in incense and gold. But one person close to him sensed the change, a woman who had seen emperors rise and fall, and who had no intention of watching from the sidelines. She would become the conspirators' most dangerous ally, and Elagabalus' deadliest enemy. Her name was Julia Misa, grandmother to Elagabalus, matriarch of the Severan dynasty, and perhaps the only person in Rome whose gaze could still make the emperor hesitate. She had watched the boy ascend to the throne at 14, carried there by her own political machinations. She had protected him when the Senate bristled at his foreign gods, shielded him when his debauchery first began to stain the streets. But now, as she heard reports of human remains served at banquets, of nobles suffocated under flowers, and of new rebirth rituals that sounded more like mass slaughter, her loyalty fractured. Julia Misa understood one truth better than anyone: power was not inherited, it was maintained. And Elagabalus, blinded by excess, was letting it slip through his blood-stained fingers. When the conspirators approached her, they did not need to convince her of his madness. They needed only to convince her that removing him would preserve the dynasty. Her reply was simple: he will not see another summer. She began her work quietly, moving like a shadow through the palace. Servants who once feared speaking now found themselves gently questioned by the grandmother empress. Captains of the Praetorian Guard were summoned for private audiences, where she spoke not of morality but of survival. When he falls, she would murmur, those who helped will rise with me. Those who resist will fall with him. Every whisper she planted was deliberate. Every glance calculated. Soon, a silent current was pulling through the palace halls, a current that flowed not toward the emperor but away from him. Elagabalus, oblivious, continued his nightly rituals, draped in gold, drenched in perfumes, dancing under torchlight while his court applauded in hollow unison. Yet occasionally, in the midst of laughter, his eyes would drift toward his grandmother. She would be watching him, expression unreadable, a faint smile on her lips. One winter night, Julia Misa walked the palace corridors alone, pausing before a massive door guarded by 2 Praetorians. Inside, the boy emperor was asleep, surrounded by the golden masks of his gods. She did not enter. She simply looked at the guards and said quietly, "Soon." The next morning, the first move of the conspiracy began. The morning was cool, the sky heavy with clouds that seemed to press down on the city. Inside the palace, Elagabalus awoke late, wrapped in silks, his head still hazy from the night's pleasures. He summoned his attendants for another day of games, unaware that most of them had already fled. The Praetorian Guard arrived just before noon. Their captain, loyal for years, bowed as always. But his voice was different when he said, "The Senate requires your presence, Caesar. Urgently." Elagabalus, suspicious, demanded his grandmother join him. Julia Misa appeared, veiled, her expression calm. "Go," she said. "They wish to honor you." He followed, flanked by guards. The corridors seemed longer than usual, the air colder. At the far end, the gates to the Praetorian barracks loomed. As they passed inside, the gates slammed shut. The applause he expected never came. Instead, the guards surrounded him, shields raised. Confusion turned to rage. He shouted at them, ordering them to their knees. None moved. Then the captain spoke, not to him but to the others. "Now." The first blow knocked him to the ground. He fought like a trapped animal, clawing at the stone, screaming promises and curses. But the end was methodical. The boy emperor who had bathed in gold and blood was dragged into a side chamber, where rope was thrown around his neck. Witnesses would later whisper that he did not die quickly, that the guards, remembering his games, made certain he felt the fear he had dealt to others. When it was over, his body was stripped, mutilated, and dragged through the streets. The people who once feared him now spat on his corpse. In the forum, they tossed him into the public latrine. Only then was what remained carried away and buried in a shallow, unmarked grave. Julia Misa did not watch the execution. She remained in her private chamber, listening to the distant roar of the crowd. When the captain returned and bowed, she simply asked, "Was it done cleanly?" He hesitated. It was done. That evening, Rome celebrated as though freed from a plague. But those who knew the truth understood something darker. The madness of Elagabalus had not been destroyed. It had merely changed hands. And in the candlelit silence of the imperial palace, Julia Misa began planning the reign of her next chosen emperor.